Hey guys, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and it's been a while since I posted a video. I just posted one earlier today that showed or explained why it is that I haven't posted anything recently. If you're interested, you can check it out. We're continuing in Biblical Theology 1, and this is the first mention of nations. If I remember right, this is actually the new chapter in the book. If you're following along in the Theocratic Kingdom, you can find it on Amazon. I wrote it. So same author name, T. Justin Comer. This is a new chapter, and what we're looking at here, we're tracing. So the book was laid out in a specific way, so that we've got kind of Genesis 1 look, Genesis 2, and then Genesis 3 with the curse and principalities and powers and Satan and how all these things kind of mingled together. Now we're coming to a place. I skipped the flood. We're coming to Genesis 10 and 11. This is the first mention of nations, and there's a reason that I skipped the flood. There's a reason that I'm going through certain things and ignoring other things. It's because the whole point is to show the focus of kingdom, and it's not that the kingdom is not focused on in the flood or Genesis 4 where Cain builds the city Enoch. In fact, the Tower of Babel here with the nations, it has its direct origin from Genesis 4. The two cities are connected. But the point that I want to get at is there's a large scope of the kingdom of God, and I think that we've ignored this kingdom. Forgive me, I've got a message coming up. But here we're starting to get into the nit and grit of it. This is where things are going to start to look like they're congealing, and you're going to begin to realize I'm not just putting random subjects forth and calling it biblical theology. There is a progression through the timeline. As we continue through Genesis, we happen across Genesis 10 and 11. Genesis 10 is considered the table of nations. There are, if I remember right, there are 70 nations mentioned, 70 or 72. I'd have to go back and count again. I don't remember. But there are 70 or 72 nations mentioned here. Ham, Shem, and Japheth are the three patriarchs of all the nations. They're the three sons of Noah. From them come all the nations, and we see each of them seem to have a different region that they tend to go to. Whereas Shem, you have it in the Middle East, that India to Israel kind of area. Ham and Canaan, their descendants seem to group closer to, from Egypt, which borders right there on the south of Israel, or it did at one point anyway. It goes like from Egypt down to what would have been in biblical times Cush, which is our modern day Ethiopia or so, and probably continuing further south. However, in the biblical narrative, it doesn't really mention anything further south than Cush, and it would go over to Libya or some of the further nations on that out. I guess it's not really a peninsula, but that outer hump on Africa. Japheth seems to be from Greece up to who knows where. It talks about certain nations that are in the far reaches of the north, and we have no idea exactly how far that is. Some people think Russia, and other people say no. But anyway, this is kind of where we're at, where Ham, Shem, and Japheth are the patriarchs of all the nations, all 70 or 72. I don't remember exactly anymore. And then from Genesis 10, you have the Tower at Babel. Now here's the interesting thing. I've heard people who are trying to criticize the Bible who would say, oh, well, these two things, you have the table of nations, and then next thing you know, the nations are coming together, and this is a contradiction. But it's not. I mean, if you read in a newspaper, 7 people killed in fatal bus crash, and then you start to read the article, and it starts talking about how the bus was traveling on this street at such and such speed at such and such time. Well, it's not that they're contradicting each other. It's that the title, Fatal Bus Crash, is giving you an idea of what the article is going to be about. And same thing with Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is giving you the table of nations. When you come to Genesis 11, this is not a contradiction. It's not a timeline here. There's not a cohesive, this happened and then that happened. These two chapters are not to be taken individually, they are together. The first tells of the nations in the following chapter or the nations that resulted from the following chapter. Either or, right? So all of the peoples come together at Babel, and then they're dispersed. Well, were they together at Babel, or did they get dispersed through, as these patriarchs would show? It's just like you would read a newspaper headline and then the story. Okay? So to establish background, let us recap where we're at. Genesis 1:26 and 27 speaks of humanity having dominion or rule over the creation. And we discussed how rule is not simply just a diplomatic or bureaucratic word. It's not a tyrant kind of ruling, or a king, or all of the things that we think of in our modern society as well as through world history. This kind of ruling is, and as we found in Genesis 2, it's a tending and keeping the garden. It's this serving, that to tend the garden. It's not like tilling up the ground and trying to get the ground to work for him. It's not work. It's a serving of the garden, and keeping it. It's actually this idea of guarding, cherishing, protecting, and that's what it means to rule. Just like when you see Paul interacting with the Christians at various places, whether in his epistles or in the book of Acts, the way that Paul interacts with people is very much a ruling over them. He does not come down on them and say, well, you need to listen to such and such because. Instead, he says, I appeal to you on the basis of love. And so we have this rulership. We have Adam naming the animals, tending and keeping the garden. We can see at the end in Revelation 22:5 that humanity rules with Christ. So from the beginning to the end, there's this rulership. Genesis 3 is the fall, and we just looked through all of that, where Eve takes of the fruit and nothing happens. Adam takes of it and their eyes are open. The woman was deceived, but Adam was not. And in this, there are now these principalities and powers that rule, that are bent towards evil, and the creation itself is in this fallen state, in this depraved state, so to speak. To establish, Genesis 3 continues with Adam and Eve hiding. It should be noted that God does not mention taking of the fruit until several statements later. That is not the original grief, but rather that Adam would hide. So where we think God's going to be like, Adam, did you eat that fruit? Because he's all-knowing, right? And so obviously if he's all-knowing, he's going to already know that Adam did take of the fruit. He's going to come down with wrath and fury. But that's not what happens. Instead, what God really gets upset about, and what God really is trying to get Adam to realize, you've never hidden from me before. Why are you suddenly hiding from me? The real sin, what really upset God, is what happened before they took that fruit. That there was somehow a disconnect from God. There was somehow a turning away. Excuse me. It wasn't the taking of the fruit itself. It was what happened in the mind and in the heart before that led to taking the fruit. They stepped away from the wisdom and character of God in order to become more like God. Do you see the problem? It's like attempting holiness without first embracing, not by might nor by strength, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And there are people who actually have helps to holiness books. They're a bunch of, I want to be really careful with my words. Oftentimes, these helps to holiness are not actually very helpful. They're actually detrimental. You cannot be holy before God by your own merit. You cannot learn to be holy because you've taken these initiatives. In certain cases, like overcoming addiction, it might be that you need to take certain initiatives. But holiness is not found. Living like Jesus, being Christ-like, is not found in doing all that you can to be like Christ. Christ-likeness is only apprehended when the man or the woman is apprehended by what it means to be Christ-like. Do you understand what I'm getting at? This is a work of God. God has to reveal to you what Christ even is, what his character even is, what his wisdom, the way he thinks, actually is. And when he reveals these things to you, it's such a stark revelation and contrast that it actually changes you. This is the way it works. And that's kind of the way that... So anyway, kind of a rant there. I went off on a rabbit trail. Sorry about that. But hopefully it helps for some of you, or all of you. Okay, getting back to our background and recapping. Genesis 3:15, God mentions two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. We saw that Cain slew Abel. Obviously, Cain was not the seed of the woman. Instead of being the deliverer, the older son is the oppressor. We would think the firstborn is to be the messianic figure, but consistently through Genesis, it is the younger and not the older. So you have Cain, not... So you have God choosing Seth and not Cain. You have God choosing Isaac and not Ishmael. You have God choosing Jacob, not Esau. Joseph is favored above his brothers. These are the patterns. Ephraim was favored over Manasseh, even though Manasseh was the older. This is a pattern. If it happens 3 times or more, it's a pattern. It happens way more than 3 times in the book of Genesis. And it continues even that David was not the oldest, all the way to the very king of Israel. The king is not the oldest, but the youngest. Do you see the pattern? In Genesis 4, we have the city of Enoch. In Genesis 4 and 5, we have the genealogy of Seth through Noah. When Seth is born, people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Here we see the seed of the woman reestablished. It is through Seth that Noah is born. It is through Cain that godliness is corrupted. Okay, so through Seth being the seed of the woman, we have Noach, the deliverer, the one who survives the flood. Cain being the seed of the woman, the godly are corrupted. As it says that the sons of God were infatuated. I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact phrase, but the sons of God were infatuated with the daughters of men, and this led to corruption, and God was grieved over the sin that he saw. Genesis 6 through 9, this is the flood. After the flood, we have Japheth and Shem are blessed, but Canaan and Ham is cursed at the end of Genesis 9. The question that was raised is it possible that they display the same kind of wickedness as before the flood? And here Noah is not condemning specifically the person because they need to be condemned, but there's an action that it stems from, and Noah is seeing the connection. So, again, to recap, we have the one seed built a city and named it Enoch. The other has no mention of building a city. And in fact, it would appear that they actually dwelt in tents instead. Oftentimes you have the patriarchs, they're dwelling in tents. Esau and Jacob. Jacob dwelt in the tents, but Esau was the hunter. This isn't to say that tents are better than cities or that technology is of the devil, but rather something more prophetically significant here. If you can give me this much, there's a prophetic nuance here. There's something happening that is speaking beyond just the words themselves. The city is often the sign of expediency and convenience. It's often the sign of luxury and comfort. The tent is the peaceful and quiet life, lived in all godliness and holiness. It doesn't have all of the convenience and expediency and luxury and comfort of the city life. It's also a lot slower. There's a lot slower pace. In order to dwell in the tents, you actually have to work with your hands. You can't just go to the store and buy whatever it is that you're trying to do. So you have to live in a much slower tempo. You have to be willing to take life as it comes. There's a peace there. There's a quiet life. There's a it's the antithesis to everything that the city represents, where there's lights all the time, the city that never sleeps, there's always something happening, there's hustle and bustle. Do you see the contrast here? This city, Enoch, was actually continued after the flood, though it was physically destroyed. And that's what I want to get at here with the first mention of nations. In Genesis 10, 8 through 12, what we have, I'll read it here. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. And you can see I have a reference here to Genesis 6:4. This is not a good thing. By the way, the mighty one, this here, he was a mighty warrior before the Lord. Literally, that word before is against the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty warrior before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the principal city, or the great city, depending on what your translation you're using. Okay, so before I move on, because I don't see that I'm going to hit this, before I move on, there's a few things I want you to notice. In the prophets, we have Babel, okay? So we have Babel, which sounds like Babylon, right? Shinar in the prophets, sometimes instead of calling the place Babylon, they'll use the word Shinar. This land of Shinar, the plains of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was built, is in the land of Babylon. It is the root of Babylon. Later, it's going to be Babylon. Do you understand what this means? You find Babylon in Genesis 10. And then later, in Revelation 17 through 19, you find Babylon. And it's called in Genesis 10, the Great City. And in Revelation 17, it is the Great City. In Revelation 11, it is the Great City where Jesus died. Now, that is a nuance we're going to get to later, I think, if I remember it. That's something we're going to get to later. In Genesis 11, it is Jerusalem being called the Great City, which is being called Babylon. But there's something happening here. There's a subtlety that we're missing because we don't understand the end from the beginning, nor the beginning from the end. So from Nimrod, who fought as a mighty warrior against the Lord, comes Assyria and Babylon. Assyria being one of the nations that is constantly at enmity with Israel, and eventually takes away the northern kingdom. Babylon, again, is the object of God's wrath against Jerusalem to even lead Judah into captivity. Do you see what's happening here? We continue into Genesis 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east. And there it is again, that whenever you read Genesis, when somebody's coming from the east, when you see that word east, it is describing something bad is about to happen. There was a garden that was planted eastward. And that's the only time in Genesis that you see a good thing relating to east. Adam and Eve were driven east from the garden. Abraham goes west, if I remember right. I'd have to look that up actually. But Abraham sends his other children after Isaac. He sends them to the east. So they journey east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. This isn't a translation I'm most familiar with. I'm used to it saying bake them thoroughly. Anyway, and they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So what's the point of baking the bricks? This is the first mention of nations. We find that they are in disobedience to God. He told them to fill the earth and to be fruitful and multiply. Instead, they've come together as an institutional one-world Antichrist government. As it was at the beginning, so it shall be at the end. This tower at Babel represents the world coming together to rival the heavens. They have banded together to ensure humanity will be godlike. It is here that we find Babel in the plains of Shinar to be the seed of the serpent. Shinar is Babylon. And the baking of bricks only goes to show the city mentality that they could not wait for them to dry in the sun. They have to bake them. So dastardly are their plans, and what's that word? So instantaneously do they need them to be finished. One of the most important details is that instead of using stone, they made bricks and baked them thoroughly. It says they had bricks for stone. Why is that so important to mention? Why waste the ink? Stones are what God has made. Bricks are what man has made. You will never find a reference to the altar of God and bricks together. The stones weren't even allowed to be cut when you make the altar. You're not allowed to chisel any stone to make the altar of God. And when you see the temple being made, it says there was not a sound of hammer and chisel to be heard in Jerusalem. All of the stones were hewn and cut outside before they're delivered. Do you see the importance here? The nations made bricks and baked them thoroughly. They could not even allow them to dry in the sun because their exaltation must be immediate. Huge things happening. This is our first mention of nations. You can see I don't have the next piece written yet, but this is our first mention of nations. From the very inception of nations, the first time the word is used, it is that the nations are at odds with God, that they are at enmity with God. They are warring against God. They're rivaling the heavens. They're trying to disobey God. This is the first mention of nations, and so it is all the way through to our modern day until the end of the age, where you have the nations coming against Jerusalem and Jesus returning and triumphing over this Antichrist. And all nations are made subject unto Israel and Jesus. God is not done with the nations simply because they're in disobedience. This is one of those things where the character of God is revealed in Scripture as something vitriolically opposed to what we would suppose. We think that God is one who's going to bring judgment and justice, and those words are interchangeably, but our judgment and our justice are not God's. Do you understand? This is the first mention, but this is not the last mention. So it's important to understand the first mention of nations as them being in disobedience to God, and that's the way that they continue throughout all of the Scriptures. They're continually trying to fight over the land of Israel and Jerusalem. Why? Because God's put his name on Israel and Jerusalem. There's something happening here. God says, go and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They say, we're going to stay right here. God puts his name on and chooses the land of Israel for the people Israel, for his inheritance and for their inheritance. And the nations then try to take it. Do you see the reversal of morality here? The nations think that they're being mighty and they're doing good. Why should we get scattered? Why would that be beneficial? It's not beneficial. So let's not get scattered and let's just remain right here. There's a morality to it that sounds so right. When you have the carnal man, there's something that sounds so right about that statement. We have it in our modern day politics even. There's something that sounds so right that the government should be helping the poor, that the government should have these programs to help jobs to be created. There are things that sound so right, but yet they're so contrary to God. I'm gonna end it right there with that statement and let you dote over that, let you think upon it. And once I finish this slide down here, you can see page 57. That's the next segment of our book here. once I finish that next segment, we'll go ahead and upload the next video in this series. Thanks for listening. Grace and peace to you in Christ.